right. Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Good. Welcome back. Welcome also to many students who are watching these satsangs online. We have a lot of nice questions from our online viewers, and we'll also take questions from those of you who are here at our ashram. Somebody had wondered, where was last week's satsang? Well, we announced at the end of this prior satsang that there would be no class, no satsang last week. So don't look for it, it's not there. So, as I said, we have a lot of questions. We won't get through all of them, so I apologize in advance if I don't get to your questions. But let's get started. Let me just check this, make sure there are no problems. That looks okay, that looks okay. Okay. So, first question comes from Vijay. Vijay is in Calicut, India. He writes, with reference to the talk I gave at our anniversary celebration of Varsha Vidya Gurukulam, I went there for last week, and I discussed about how enlightenment takes place. And you mentioned that self-realization is nothing but knowing that you are the Surupa of Atma and that it will come naturally. I didn't exactly say it'll come naturally. You also said that self-realization can be sustained by compassion. That's not really what I said. I'm afraid Vijay didn't fully understand what I said. Let me summarize. It was a very important talk, by the way, and I would highly recommend you go and look for it. Let me summarize it. It was just 20 minutes, so I think we can summarize it in 2 minutes. I think so. Let's try, because we have a lot of questions here. So the summary is, it was a response to the question, are you enlightened yet? And this question is often based on a wrong concept, a wrong notion, that enlightenment is a big event, an earth-shattering, a bolt of lightning, like that kind of ecstatic event. And that's a common idea. It happens to be wrong. So, enlightenment is a process, not an event. In fact, my guru said that, those very words he said thousands of times. Enlightenment is not an event. Here's how it happens. First of all, these teachings, you've heard these teachings a lot, they haven't led to enlightenment yet because there are a lot of impediments in your mind. So the first stage, if it's a process, processes have stages, right? The first stage of the process is preparing your mind in such a way that these teachings can click. You've heard these teachings a lot. If it had clicked by now, then you would have said, yeah, I got it. But if you say, no, I haven't gotten it yet, they haven't clicked. And the reason they haven't clicked is there are impediments in your mind. We call them pratibandhas. Pratibandha is a Sanskrit word for an impediment to enlightenment. So the first stage is removing these impediments, removing the pratibandhas. When the impediments are removed, then click. But click is not a bolt of lightning. Click is you get it. You say, oh, now I get it. That's so simple. Honestly, I'm giving you what I think is a very accurate portrayal, much more accurate than an ecstatic experience. People have ecstatic experiences all the time, but that's not the same as enlightenment. An ecstatic experience comes and goes. Does enlightenment come and go? Anyway, that's another topic. That's not Vijay's question. So there is a process of preparation. When that preparation is sufficient, click, now I got it. That's so simple. In fact, to me, it's like this. Why didn't I get that before? I think that's much more accurate than an ecstatic experience. But then you've got it, but you're not fully established in it. Our minds are highly habitual. You have lived in a state of ignorance for how long? Decades. Do you expect decades of mental conditioning to vanish in an instant? That's an unreasonable expectation. So therefore, after you get it, after that click, there's a process of assimilation. So here we go. We have the whole process now, a process of preparation, which includes cultivating values like contentment. Vijay asked about this contentment. So process of preparation, cultivating values, meditation, practice of bhakti, karma yoga, everything that's required to make the mind prepared. Then there's a click, which need not be an ecstatic experience. Might for some people, could be, but it's the click that's important. The ecstatic experience goes away. The click, I'm using click as a metaphor for self-recognition, to recognize your true nature. And then that click is followed by another phase of this process, a phase of assimilation where the main practice shifts to nididhyasana, Vedic contemplation, which is not our topic right now. So that's our 2 minutes summary. If you want it in more detail, you can go watch that talk. Am I enlightened yet, I think is the title. Next question from Arun, who lives in Bangalore. Arun asks, is there a distinction between Vedantic self-inquiry and the self-inquiry taught by Sri Ramana Maharishi? Is there a difference? That's an interesting question. And yes and no. There's no difference in the sense that both practices of self-inquiry are inquiring into the same self. So there's only one and the same self, so you can't say Ramana is going for one self and the Upanishads, the ancient rishis, are going for another. There's no difference, so they are identical in the sense that they are both practices of self-inquiry meant to lead you to discover your true nature. But they differ at a different level. Fundamentally, they are the same. At a different level, at another level, they differ in this way. Ramana's teachings are based on Ramana's experiences and his spiritual practice. The teachings of Vedanta are based on the experiences and teachings of the ancient rishis. And there's some difference between Ramana's approach and the approach of the ancient rishis. Notice I'm not saying one is better and one is, you should do this one and you shouldn't do that one. I'm not saying that at all. They both work. Ramana's technique worked for him, And the approach of the ancient rishis worked for the ancient rishis and worked for many of us. So you can choose. Actually, it might be better to choose both, but if you had to choose one, here's an observation. They both work, absolutely, they both work. But if you had to choose one, here's an observation. Ramana Maharishi was not exactly an ordinary person, right? He got enlightened when he was a teenager. What were you like when you were a teenager? What was I like? Oh, God. Anyway, he was a remarkable person. Could we say being enlightened as a teenager means you're a prodigy? That would be a good judgment to make. So Ramana was a spiritual prodigy. So his teachings are based on his experience. He got it very easily, being a prodigy. So his teachings reflect that. And just to help you get the idea of it, suppose, a little subtle point, suppose back in your college days, you went to a class taught by a brilliant professor of physics, a Nobel laureate. And that Nobel laureate would stand up in the class and he'd say, this stuff is so simple. I don't need to explain it to you. Just go read the book and show up for the exam. That's what your professor might have said, because it was easy for him or her. The point I'm making is when it's too easy for a teacher, let me put it the other way around. A teacher who has to struggle a lot as a student ends up being a better teacher. That's intuitive, right? Someone who has it too easy might take a lot of things for granted, but somebody who has to struggle a lot as a student makes a better teacher. So for this reason, Ramana didn't have to. He'd had different kinds of struggles in his life, absolutely. But he was a prodigy, he was a spiritual genius. So if I had to choose between, I've studied both, I've practiced both, I know both work. But if I had to choose one, I would probably choose the Vedantic self-inquiry. I would say, in fact, the Vedantic self-inquiry includes what Ramana taught. So we could say that Ramana is like a subset. I think this is accurate, to say that Ramana's teachings is a subset of the wider teachings of Advaita Vedanta. He doesn't teach anything different than Advaita Vedanta, but he doesn't teach the whole thing. He doesn't teach as broadly as the Vedantic tradition does. So they are both powerful methods of self-inquiry. All right, one more question here, and then we'll see if we have questions here. This is a question from Bennett, who lives in Melbourne, Australia, with regard to our classes on Upadesha Sahasri. It says, there are two kinds of liberation, moksha, jivan mukti and videha mukti. Jivan mukti means mukti, liberation, jivan, while you're alive. Videha mukti means liberation, videha, without a body, after you've died. What happens to the jiva okay, it references now to videha mukti. It removes all sanchita karma and breaks the cycle of samsara, correct? There's no rebirth when you die because of videha mukti. So the question is, what happens to the jiva then? When an enlightened person dies, what happens? When an unenlightened person dies, you get reborn. And not necessarily in a human form, but in some form, you get reborn. So what happens to the jivan mukta when he or she dies? Becomes videha mukta, and no reincarnation. And Bennett's comment is significant here. It seems so scary to lose duality Meaning, and let me try to get inside of Bennett's mind, so to speak, and it's looking at the dissolution of the individual at when an enlightened person dies. Individuality is obliterated, and that can sound scary. I don't want to be obliterated. People feel like that. And obliteration, I'm using this word intentionally to make the point. Obliteration doesn't exactly sound desirable. I want to be obliterated. All of that is true. But now consider this. In deep sleep, dreamless sleep, your individuality is indeed obliterated. Are you afraid of sleep? He says it's so scary to lose duality. In deep sleep, you experience no duality. Deep sleep is scary? We love it. So, it's an incorrect conclusion to take this word obliteration and turn it into something scary. It is the absolute absence of suffering. To use positive words, it is a state of perfect, uninterrupted peace. Deep sleep you wake up from, interrupted. Imagine. Perfect, uninterrupted. When you're awake, you have moments of peace, moments of contentment, moments of happiness. Imagine continued contentment and peace, uninterrupted. That's the state for a jivan, for a videha mukta. Good questions. Do we have any questions here? There's a question here. You need the microphone.
So I wanted to go back to the question that I asked you as you were leaving Archavidya, where I had asked you that if everything is Ishvara, right? And suppose like when you're driving, someone flips you off, right? Mm-hmm. You said it was a abuse of free will. So I was having a discussion with someone, and they said, so if it's an abuse of free will, is that not Ishvara, and what is it, and how can it exist separately from Ishvara, right? So I got confused.
Okay, free will.
Okay.
Free will is not separate from Ishvara. Ishvara gave us free will. Our free will operates within the laws of Ishvara. Can you use your free will to flap your arms and fly? Why not? You have free will. Do it. You get my point. We have free will within a range. And the range is determined by Ishvara, not by us. So free will is given by Ishvara. Free will is within the range that Ishvara gives us, and Ishvara gives us enough free will. There's an American metaphor. You give them enough rope to hang yourself. What a grim metaphor. You get enough rope to hang yourself. So Ishvara gives us enough free will, not to hang ourselves, but to get into trouble. When we abuse our free will, we cause suffering for others, we cause suffering for ourselves. So in that sense, Ishvara gives us that rope, so to speak. Is that okay? Okay. Any other question? A question in back here? You'll need the microphone.
Good morning, Swamiji. I'm visiting from Dubai. Actually, I've been listening to your lectures. Thank you. I had a quick question or rather a clarification. You mentioned in one of the classes earlier that ignorance is a result of existence of knowledge. In
Say
terms,
that again?
ignorance exists from the Eastern philosophy perspective, Advaita perspective, because of knowledge.
Ignorance exists because of knowledge.
Because it is the
That doesn't sound right.
Okay.
So can you try to put it in other terms?
So I'm just trying to understand that in the class we had before this, when we were talking about the Eastern and the Western philosophy in terms of ignorance, the word ignorance, you mentioned something about knowledge and lack of knowledge creating ignorance. This
So
ignorance.
let's clarify that, especially for the sake of our online audience, and that is the Western concept of ignorance is an absence of knowledge.
Okay.
The Vedantic perspective of ignorance is the presence of a factor which obscures or covers a truth.
Okay.
So it is the removal of that so-called veil of ignorance.
Okay.
The metaphor that's often used in Vedanta is metaphor is like darkness. In ancient times, darkness was considered to cover objects, and light removes darkness. So as light removes darkness, ignorance removes. I'm sorry, knowledge removes ignorance. So with this in mind, go ahead and
No, so I
restate
think
your
that is the
question.
clarification I wanted to have. That because when you're in the dream state
Yes.
and then the deep sleep state, so in the waking state you have the existence of mind and intellect, which creates knowledge. Then when you move into the dream state, you have the mind and probably the presence of intellect as well. But in the deep sleep state, you do not. So how in the deep sleep state you're still not enlightened, because but at the same time because perhaps there's existence of ignorance even at that stage.
Sure.
But there is no existence of mind and intellect at that deep sleep state.
Correct.
So how does that happen? What is the logic? Because isn't the mind and
What is the logic? What would make the ignorance is present until it's removed?
Okay.
So why should ignorance not be present?
Does the
in
mind
deep
and
sleep?
intellect not have any? Does the mind and the intellect have no factor in creation of ignorance or removal?
Creation of ignorance?
Yeah, like so, for example.
Does ignorance get created? You're asking some very profound questions about ignorance. This turns out to be one of the most complicated topics in Advaita Vedanta. For example, I just asked a question you've never thought about. Does ignorance get created? And before I'll answer that question, but before I do, I'd like you to appreciate something. We're having a debate about ignorance. What do we hope to accomplish through a deep analysis of ignorance? And I'm making a point because it turns out in commentaries and sub-commentaries, a lot of these great scholars get into huge raging debates about the nature of ignorance. Tell me, wouldn't it be better to focus our attention on knowledge instead of ignorance? I mean, yes, we need to understand ignorance, but understand it to the extent that we need to for the sake of removing it. So in my mind, a lot of folk, and this is not, I don't think you're going there, but there is amongst some scholars, there is an intense interest in the nature of ignorance. And in my view, it's misdirected effort. Now, but as I said, it turns out to be a technical and complex issue, which is why these scholars can go on arguing. And as an example of the complexity of ignorance, we have to say, is ignorance created? And here's the problem. If ignorance is created at a point in time, before that point in time there is no ignorance, absence of ignorance means knowledge, so then knowledge is followed by ignorance. Wait a minute. That's illogical. Knowledge can't be followed by ignorance, which means ignorance can't be created. Ignorance has no beginning in time. We are all born Ignorant,
Okay.
right? Ignorance is uncreated.
Got it.
And then that ignorance is present in the waking state, dream state, and deep sleep state until it gets removed.
Got it.
Then there's no more ignorance. Does that?
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you. I'll pass this
Yeah, one more question here, and then we'll take some more questions online. You don't have. You had a question. It's on.
It's on, sorry. Swami, we know that we don't have control over emotions.
Yes.
Do we have control over free will?
By definition.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not free.
Okay, thank you.
So there, if we, just to expand on your question a little bit, there are certain aspects of our mind which we control, certain aspects of our mind over which we have no control. And as I've said in other classes, we have no direct control over emotions. We have indirect control over emotions. We can choose where we direct our, there are various ways. But we can choose, I can choose to hold my hand like this or like this. This is free will. And by definition, it's a matter of choice. Free will is an example. Free will is choice, mental choice. Okay. Okay, let's take some online questions. We have so many questions today. What is the Vedantic way of dealing with toxic people? Particularly toxic close family members. Oh my gosh. This is a question from Neil in Atlanta. Neil, I hope your family members aren't watching this satsang. Okay, what is a Vedanta? Is a Vedantic solution, and we generally think of one solution as just cut them off, just avoid them. Or another solution is if you're really a Vedantin, you should be able to tolerate it and continue to let them emotionally abuse you. That don't sound so good either. So look at these two extremes. One is if there's a toxic family member, if you're the head of the household, throw them out. If you're not the head of the household, you go out. So that's one way of dealing with toxic family members, one extreme manner. The other extreme is do nothing. After all, you're supposed to have titiksha, the value of forbearance, and just accept whatever emotional abuse or physical happens. Physical abuse also happens, certainly not in Neil's family, but it happens in some families. So you should, and to just tolerate all that abuse. You can see both of these extremes are inappropriate. The first one we don't need to talk about. The second one of tolerating abuse, you have a dharmic responsibility to prevent harm to your own body and mind. To allow yourself to be abused is adharmic, full stop. You have a responsibility to eat healthy, take care of your physical body. You have a responsibility to take care of your emotions. Well, it means don't allow physical or emotional abuse. So that total acquiescence to the situation is not dharma. Some people think dharma means you surrender. Some people will say it's God's will. Dangerous. And especially, this, anyway, let me not get into, I get myself in trouble. Let me not go there. So, you say it's God's will. Well, God gave you free will also, right? God gave you a body and mind, and God gave you the intelligence to recognize when you're being abused And God gave you the intelligence to get out of an abusive situation. So this argument, oh, it's God's will, is an invalid argument. It's God's will that arsenic is poisonous. So I don't know, that metaphor doesn't work. We'll leave it aside. Doesn't mean, if it's God's will that arsenic is poisonous, doesn't mean that you have to eat it. Right? It's not a great metaphor, but you get the point. So, what is a Vedantic approach should be someplace in between those two extremes. And we could talk about this a lot, but instead let me share with all of you and let me share with Neil my guru's wonderful, very short way of dealing with this problem. He had a way of expressing profound truths with very few words. And here's what he said. Toxic people, he said toxic, what a funny metaphor. Toxic people are like, what is this word? Cactus. Huh? You come close, you get pricked. Toxic people are like cacti, I suppose I should say. So they're like cacti. You come close, you get pricked. So then he said, there are some people that you have to love from a distance. That's it. You love them from a distance. Need not be physical distance. There's such a thing as emotional distance. And an example of emotional distance is to treat someone in a more formal manner, to avoid all the very deep psychological conversations, and just to keep things on a more formal or superficial level. That would be emotional distance. Physical distance makes sense as well. All right. Next question from Yogi, who lives in Glasgow, Scotland. He asks, for those of us who grew up in atheistic or agnostic households, those of us who have never prayed in any religious context, how can we pray for Ishvara's blessings? The context is that I've said several times that some form of prayer or worship is indispensable in spiritual life. Doesn't mean you have to be pious and all of this, but there has some form, any form of prayer, of being related to Ishvara, that higher, so-called higher power. So the question is, for someone who is raised in a completely non-religious background, how to develop that. It's not easy. It's not. But it can be developed. Anything can be developed. Let me give a metaphor. Suppose the first time, I have to tell you, this is funny. The first time I heard South Indian classical music, Carnatic music, the first time I heard it, it was just, I mean, sorry, I don't mean to make, it just sounded horrible to me. I couldn't stand it. This is not music. Somehow even Hindustani music took me a little while to become familiar with, but this Carnatic music didn't sound like music to me initially. Well, it happens that my guru loves it. So at our ashram, we would hear it again and again. He would invite these big artists to our ashram who would give these performances. Oh, what an interesting anecdote. So one of the biggest artists in those days was a great Tamilian singer, this Maharajapuram Santanam, well known. He's no more. But he was a close friend of my guru. And almost every year, he would be invited to our ashram to give a concert. Guess who was in charge of the sound system? That was one of my jobs as a student, was to set up and run the sound equipment. And of course, to run sound equipment, you have to listen really carefully. Look at the irony. So here I am listening really carefully, but this guy was a world-renowned artist. And it took me a while, but I got it. So I learned to appreciate South Indian classical music by listening. That's it, by listening. But by listening to the best. So this is a nice metaphor. How to learn how to pray. By praying with the best, meaning some kind of satsang where you associate with other people who have already cultivated a deep sense of devotion for Ishvara. Through your association with those people who are blessed with that deep devotion, you can acquire it. But you acquire it not merely by being with them, but by praying with them. And like I was part of the concert too, not like he was, but I had a role. I was in the music. You can't just be an observer, you have to be in. So to pray in the company of others who have a deeply developed prayer life will help anyone cultivate a prayer life, cultivate devotion. And devotion must be cultivated. For many people, it is cultivated at home if they're raised in some kind of religious household. But as Yogi says, so many people are not raised in such a household, so it has to be cultivated later. I used this joke in a recent class. When you were in college or high school, did you ever have to take a remedial course? You take a remedial course to make up for something you didn't get before. So if you didn't get in your childhood, in your home, if you didn't have the opportunity to develop a prayer life, then you need some remedial work, so to speak, which is not a criticism. It's a good thing. It's important to do that so-called remedial work. This is a question from Shankar, who lives in Hyderabad. Shankar asks, all my elders perform many rituals at the time of death of a family member, and then later on a yearly basis, as shraddha ceremonies. They say that these rituals help departed elders to have food, water, etc., and help them reach punya lokas. Is there any scriptural basis to these beliefs? Well, the departed elders don't need food and water. They need blessings. They need good karma. And some of these rituals are a way of kind of sending good karma, sending blessings, invoking God's blessings upon the departed souls. And that's done symbolically. There's offerings of food and water are symbolic. It's not, for example, in shraddha ceremonies, there are these balls of rice, pindas, that are sanctified in a ritual, and then they are left outside after the ritual. Specifically, they're left outside for other animals, and in particular birds, and crows in particular, to eat. And this is all symbolic. So the crow comes and eats this rice, which has been sanctified for the sake of invoking Ishvara's blessings on departed elders. The crows eat the sanctified rice and fly off to the heavens, metaphorically transporting your blessings to the departed souls. So, and there is a scriptural basis for all such rituals. And so the answer to the first question is there any scriptural basis to these beliefs? Yes, but the beliefs have to be understood. It's not mechanically, you're not feeding your elders, but metaphorically you are invoking blessings for them. His last question is, I also request your personal opinion of this. That's fun. That's good. I like that because it gives me a chance to add something else. If you were to ask, if Shankar were to ask, but how do we know for sure that our blessings reach the departed souls? We don't know. Scriptures say you can believe those scriptures. Suppose you don't believe in those scriptures. Then do all these end-of-life rituals and the yearly rituals, do they all become meaningless if you don't happen to believe in these traditions and rituals and those particular scriptures? I would say that's really a harmful conclusion. This is all a bunch of nonsense. Somebody used the word hogwash. What is hogwash anyway? You wash hogs? I don't know. Anyway, it's an American word for nonsense, hogwash. I would say that whether or not these rituals bless the departed souls, we don't know for sure. One thing we know for sure is that those rituals bless us. We know that for sure. When we lose a loved one, we need some way of processing that grief. And when a community, when a family comes together, that itself is a ritual. If you do more ritual, presumably it's more healing. So simple ritual is somewhat healing. More elaborate rituals done by a community or family would be more healing. So whether or not it actually blesses the departed souls is beside the point here. It's important for us, and not just at the time of death, but perhaps every year as well. Whether or not it blesses it, setting out those pindas, whether or not it really helps the departed soul, I don't know. But I know for sure it helps the person who performs those rituals. No doubt about it. Okay. Another question here is from Amit, who lives in India. Amit asks, how many times a day should we perform nididhyasana, and for how long? Nididhyasana means Vedantic contemplation, and we could say how long to perform any kind of spiritual practice. How long to meditate, how long to pray, how many times a week to do puja, how often to go to a temple, how often to do this, when to do this, when not to do this. Some people are into this astrology. So there's Yamakala, Rahu Kala. Anyway, when to do, when not to. To me, a lot of that misses the point for two reasons. Actually, there's Rahu Kala is another thing. We'll leave that aside. The main reason this misses the mark is that we are all different. We all have different religious needs. We all have different spiritual needs. Therefore, to set up a system that's very rigid. Do this once a week. Do this every day. Do this 3 times a day. That kind of rigid system doesn't really meet individual needs. And think about it, many religions, including certain parts of the Hindu tradition, have these rigid rules. You have to fast on every one of. I was raised in a Roman Catholic church. And back in the early days, before the church underwent some big reforms in the early 60s. I was part of it before those reforms, and we had to not only go to church, if you don't go to church every Sunday, you're finished. I mean, it was a big deal, that big a deal. If you miss a Sunday Mass, mortal sin. A mortal sin is a sin that condemns you to hell unless you have some expiation for that sin. Missing a Mass was an example, which is every Sunday without exception. And another thing we had to do, again, this is in the pre-Reformed church, we had to avoid eating meat on Fridays. Why only on Fridays? So I must be more holy now. I don't even eat it any day. No, I'm making a point. Why only on Fridays? If it's a good thing to do, then shouldn't you do it every day? If it's good not to eat meat on Friday, then why eat it on Saturday, Sunday, Monday? You get my point. Anyway, this kind of rigid do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that, is a kind of, it's a practice suitable for some people and extremely unsuitable for others. Some people need that kind of structure. You know that some people are very casual in their lives and they don't know what to do and they don't know, their lives are like blowing, like a leaf blowing in the wind. Some people need structure. For those kinds of people, such a religious or spiritual practice, do this, don't do that, is good for them. But I have a feeling most of you, and most of you watching this satsang, are probably not like that. Most of us have enough structure in our life, and some of us don't like to be told what to do. And fortunately, here we have a tradition which accommodates us. If we are disciplined, we are free to choose practices according to our individual needs. I think that's wonderful. Not every tradition does that. Our tradition most certainly does. Okay, another question here. Question from Jayant, lives in Raipur. Jayant asks, why don't we find Vedantic teachings in the Ramayana like we do find in the Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita? Of course, Bhagavad Gita, as I'm sure Jayant knows, Bhagavad Gita is a portion of the Mahabharata. So why don't we find Vedantic teachings in the Ramayana? I think the more interesting question is, why do we find Vedantic teachings in the Mahabharata? So the Ramayana and Mahabharata are called itihasa. They are historical epics. And Ramayana tells the story of Rama. Mahabharata tells the story of the Pandavas. And so these are historical epics. The main purpose of the Ramayana is to tell the story of Rama. The main purpose of the Mahabharata is to tell the story of the Pandavas. And Mahabharata is actually the name of the war. So the war is really the central part of the scripture. So, really speaking, these scriptures are not intended to impart spiritual teachings. They're intended to tell a historical story. So then I think the question is, why is there so much Vedanta in the Mahabharata? And there's a reason for that. Mahabharata is a big topic. Let me try to do it very, very succinctly. 84,000 verses could not possibly have been written by one historical person. Not possible. Vyasa was not a single person. There were generations of Vyasas. Later, the early generations of the Vyasas, they recorded the story. By the way, the Mahabharata itself talks about 3 versions. Talks about a short version, middle version, long version. That's taught in the Adi Parva of the Mahabharata itself. So how did those extra versions get added on? Whoever wrote the first version obviously didn't write that part about 3 versions. When the first Vyasa was writing the first part, there was only 1 version. Anyway, big topic. The Mahabharata evolved, as many scriptures do over a period of time. So we could say later Vyasas, we say descendants of Vyasa, added these Vedantic teachings to the Mahabharata. But strictly speaking, as an itihasa, its main purpose is to teach us about that war and about the consequences of that war. Main purpose of Ramayana is to teach us about following dharma and the consequences of not following dharma. So, for that reason. There is, by the way, just a side issue. There is such a thing as an adhyatmika Ramayana, a spiritual version of the Ramayana, which was written maybe adhyatma, not adhyatmika. Adhyatma Ramayana is a text. It's about 1,000 years old, written by some great scholar. I've studied portions of it, and it's a wonderful text, but it neither teaches the Ramayana story as it was originally taught, nor does it teach Vedanta as it's traditionally taught. It's the scholar's own. The scholar had his own version of the Ramayana and his own version of Vedanta, and all of that is taught in the Adhyatma Ramayana. So anyway, I'm not saying not to study it. I'm just saying don't expect to find the traditional story of Ramayana in it, and don't expect to find traditional teachings of Advaita Vedanta in it. Okay. Other questions here? No? In back, you'll need the microphone.
Thanks. Swamiji, you mentioned the impediments to enlightenment in the beginning. The external distractions and mind chatter, everything. Was this intentional? I mean, to prevent us from knowing the truth? I mean, or to get to enlightenment? If it was made easy, I feel most of us would be enlightened, and world would be a better place to.
Okay, that's nicely put. If we had no impediments, we'd all be enlightened by now, right? Absolutely correct. But then these impediments are natural to the human condition. We discussed before ignorance, your question. Ignorance is natural. We're all born ignorant. And we're also born with the consequences of that ignorance, which includes all of these impediments. So we say that we're due to our karmas. We're born as we are, with whatever. Every one of us are born with certain blessings and certain disadvantages. All of us. We have certain unique blessings and certain unique burdens that we will bear in this life. That's true for us all. But one thing that's common among us all is we're all born unenlightened. And then we have to come out of that ignorance. Any follow-up for that, or is that okay?
No, it's just that I feel it was, since I'm in technology, I'm thinking more, was it done on purpose, these external controls, so not to get to the truth or enlightenment quickly?
So your question about purpose, human beings have purpose. Do atoms have purpose?
No.
So you're applying a very human kind of thinking to the cosmos, which doesn't function like a human being. Nature is natural. We'll put it this way, nature has no agenda. Nature has no agenda to make you suffer. And if there is an agenda, if we think of Ishvara as karma pala data, the giver of the fruits of our actions, the purpose is that we should receive good things for our good deeds, and we should receive suffering for our harmful deeds. That's the biggest picture. But this idea of purpose is a very human, philosophers will call this thinking anthropocentric. We superimpose humanness on things which are not human. Nature is not human. Ishvara is not human. Does that help?
Yes, Swamiji. Thanks.
Okay, let's take a few more questions online and then we'll wrap up. Next question from Malar. Malar? From Coimbatore, South India. My Guru's ashram is near Coimbatore. When we lose our ahankara when we're absorbed in music. I give this example a lot to help understand the word ahankara, ego, is very abstract. What exactly is ahankara? Some things are best known through their absence. When you get lost in the music, listening to your favorite music, that which gets lost is ahankara. And I would prefer calling it sense of individuality. Gets lost in a state of absorption, like, for example, listening to music. And he says that in situations like that, do we experience time in a different way? When you're absorbed in, like, listening to music, do you experience time differently? You might or you might not. It's not connected at all. Our experience of time is independent of the presence or absence of ahankara. If you're right now your ahankara is present, you experience the passage of time. You might experience that, oh, the satsang should be ending pretty soon. That would be an accurate, but even if you were absorbed in this satsang, I don't know how that would take place, but if you were in a state of absorption, you might have exactly the same feeling, that the satsang is about ready to reach its end. No connection between your experience of time and absorption. Next question from Shaku. Shaku lives in Texas. Shaku writes, I presume it's she, Shakuntala usually. I don't know if it could be a male name, I suppose, but let's assume it's Shakuntala. Shaku writes, we've talked about 2 bars in the enlightenment process. Not bars, two arrival points in the enlightenment process. The first arrival point is a recognition of your true self, and the ultimate arrival point is moksha, being free from suffering. So the first arrival point is discovery of your true self. Second arrival point is being free from suffering. And in fact, that's exactly what we referred to before about the my talk at the Arsha Vedigurukulam. We said there's a process of preparation which culminates in self-discovery, and then there's a process of assimilation which culminates in complete freedom from suffering. Okay? With that in mind, Shaku asks, does understanding that nothing in the world, that no worldly accomplishment will bring contentment, does that qualify as recognition of the true self? Okay, this is another point of arrival. We're talking about, first of all, let me make it clear. Shaku is asking about another point in that timeline. And that point in the timeline is the conviction that no amount of worldly achievements will give you permanent, unbroken contentment and perfect peace. That's a point of arrival. Where should we put that in this timeline? The recognition that worldly achievements can never culminate in perfect contentment. That happens during the stage of preparation, usually fairly early in that stage of preparation. Because unless you recognize that worldly achievements will never lead to complete contentment, you're not likely to continue on this timeline. And if you think worldly achievements can give you permanent contentment, you won't be on this timeline at all. You'll be at the mall buying goodies. So we can maybe add that to our timeline, and maybe we can say that the real beginning, and I think this would be valid to say, that where does this timeline begin? This timeline, the process of spiritual growth. I would say that what Shaku is referring to is the first part. Real spiritual growth begins with the recognition that worldly achievements will never, ever be enough. That's when it begins. Let's take one or two more questions and we'll see. This is Prashanto, writes from Bangladesh. I was in the last Uddhava Gita class, we had a reference to Bhishma. And talking about Bhishma, I said, one can escape from suffering, but not from karma. Bhishma was free from suffering. He was enlightened. So he was, laying on that proverbial bed of nails at the end of his life after the war is over. So Bhishma could escape from suffering. He wasn't suffering. He was laying there nicely. Certainly there was pain in the body, but no suffering. As you know, it's possible to have pain without suffering. That's not our topic now, but that's there. So Bhishma had physical pain, Bhishma had no suffering, but he couldn't escape from karma. If that is the case for lay people like us, then getting enlightenment is extremely remote, as we have had numerous past lives with bad karma. Well, you've got a lot of bad karma, so did Bhishma. That's why he ended up on the bed of nails. That's why he ended up living. I told that mythological story. I don't want to, not mythological. I told the story of Bhishma as one of the 8 Vasus being cursed. I don't want to tell that whole story again here. Here, you can go and watch that episode of the Uddhava Gita class, last one. I think it was the last one or one before that, I forget. So I don't want to go to it. Here's the point. We are all born with plenty of bad karmas. After all, how many prior lives have you had with opportunities to build up bad karmas? According to the doctrine of karma, we have all had an infinite number of prior lives, and in an infinite number of prior lives, we've all managed to accumulate an infinite amount of papa karma. The other side is also true. We've accumulated an infinite amount of good karma. So, Bhishma got enlightened not because of his karma. Bhishma got enlightened because he discovered his true self. So it's not a matter of karma. We are all born with plenty of bad karma. Karma does not determine your future. Okay, let me just pick. There are so many more questions here. Let me just pick one. Okay, we'll make this the last one. This is from Juan, who lives in Miami, Juan. He asks, he read Paramahamsa Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi, famous book. Everyone's read it. I think most spiritual seekers have read that book. It's very inspiring. It also has some problems. We'll not get into all of that right now, but very inspiring. Good. And he learned in that book about how important it is, the relationship between guru and disciple. With that in mind, Juan asks, I have some questions about your guru. Could you please share his name? His name is Swami Dayananda Saraswati. He is a disciple of Swami Chinmayananda Saraswati, who is initiated by Swami Shivananda Saraswati, and it goes back generation after generation. And so he is. How did the first of you two meet? In 1981, I was a 30-something spiritual seeker, and I had been starting to learn a little bit about yoga and Vedanta. He came to the town in California where I lived. I heard him speak, and my situation maybe was everyone's situation is unique, because I had some background before meeting him. If I hadn't had any background, I would have been impressed. But because, did I say that right? If I didn't have a background, I would still have been impressed. But because I had some background, I knew he's the one. So I had that recognition that here is a teacher who can take me all the way. Is there a particular memory or event with your guru that holds special place in your heart? I've just described it. And actually, let me just add to it. His topic on that particular day was talking about Ishvara. Remember now, my background, so I came from a Christian background. I rejected all of that when I was still a kid, and I had rejected all of that stuff. Probably by the time I was 9 or 10, I didn't want anything to do with it. It helped me before, but then it stopped helping me. But then as a young man, I wanted some kind of religion, spirituality in my life. So, but I had been, let me make one point, and we'll wrap up this satsang. I had a bad experience as a young Christian when I was told by religious professionals that I should just believe everything, blind faith, and I shouldn't question anything. I shouldn't try to use reasoning and try to understand anything. I should just believe. That turned me off completely. Not just to religion, but even to God was a belief. So I got turned off to belief in God. I was what the technical word is, I was agnostic. I wasn't atheist, I was agnostic. I said God is not something I believe in. I have no belief in God. And Puja Swamiji's, Swami Dayananda's topic on that day was Ishvara, and I'll summarize it in just one sentence. Ishvara, the word we use for God in this tradition, Ishvara is not a matter of faith. Ishvara is a reality to be understood. I'll say that again. Ishvara in this tradition of Advaita Vedanta, Ishvara is not a matter of faith. Ishvara is a reality to be understood. And that put me on this track, and that was the wonderful experience. 1981 is a while ago. All right, we'll end with our prayers. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinaha sarve santu niramayaha sarve bhadrani pashyantu ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet, asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat. See you next time.